The call came through diplomatic channels in early 2024. Not a formal state visit request. Not an official bilateral meeting, but a personal outreach from Barack Obama, expressing interest in visiting Burkina Faso to understand the economic reforms Traoré had been implementing. Specifically, the gold sector restructuring that had generated international attention and controversy. Obama's post-presidency had evolved into a carefully curated role as global statesman. He selected causes and countries strategically. Africa had always been central to his identity narrative, and his foundation's work focused heavily on leadership development across the continent. A visit to Burkina Faso under Traoré's leadership would be significant. The young military captain who'd challenged Western security frameworks and renegotiated mining contracts. Obama positioning himself as the thoughtful progressive who could engage where others had failed. The Obama team's preliminary outreach suggested a visit focused on economic development and governance. Obama wanted to meet with Traoré privately, tour gold mining operations, speak with economic officials, and potentially deliver a public speech about African development and leadership. It would be framed as supportive engagement from a respected figure. But Traoré's team immediately recognized the subtext. Obama wasn't coming to learn. He was coming to influence. To subtly pressure Traoré to moderate his approach to resource nationalism in ways that protected American corporate interests while appearing to support African agency. The entire visit would be photographed and publicized. Obama, the first black American president, engaging with a young African leader. The optics would be powerful and create pressure for Traoré to appear cooperative and grateful for the attention. Any pushback would be framed as disrespecting a historic figure who represented black achievement globally. Traoré's economic advisors were divided. Some argued that refusing Obama would be politically costly and miss an opportunity to explain Burkina Faso's position to someone with genuine global influence. Others argued that accepting the visit meant accepting Obama's framing and losing control of the narrative about their economic reforms. Traoré listened to both sides. Then made his decision. He would not refuse the visit outright, that would indeed create unnecessary conflict. But he would structure it in ways that prevented Obama from achieving his actual objectives while maintaining diplomatic courtesy. The response sent through diplomatic channels was polite but clear. President Obama would be welcome to visit Burkina Faso. However, given security considerations and the operational sensitivity of mining operations currently under contract renegotiation, access to active mining sites would not be possible. Meetings would be limited to official government offices in Ouagadougou. And any public speech would need to be reviewed and approved in advance to ensure it didn't interfere with ongoing economic negotiations with multiple international partners. The Obama team pushed back immediately. These restrictions would make the visit pointless. The whole purpose was to see the mining operations, to understand the on-ground reality, to engage with stakeholders beyond just government officials. Without that access, what was the point? Traoré's response, delivered through his foreign minister, was diplomatic but firm. Burkina Faso greatly respects President Obama and values his interest in our development path. However, we cannot provide access to mining operations that are currently subject to sensitive contract renegotiations. Doing so could compromise our negotiating position and create perception that external pressure is influencing outcomes. We hope President Obama understands that protecting Burkina Faso's economic sovereignty must take precedence over accommodation of even the most distinguished visitors. The real message was clear. Obama could come, but only on terms that prevented him from serving as a tool of pressure on behalf of mining companies or Western economic interests. After several weeks of back-channel diplomacy trying to negotiate better access, Obama's team made a decision. They would proceed with the visit anyway. The mere fact of Obama going to Burkina Faso and meeting with Traoré would send a message. And perhaps once there, with cameras rolling and diplomatic pressure applied in person, Traoré would be more flexible than he was being through official channels. It was a miscalculation. When Obama arrived in Ouagadougou in March 2024, the welcome was professional but notably restrained. No large crowds organized to greet him. No elaborate state ceremony. A respectful reception appropriate for a former head of state, but nothing that suggested Burkina Faso was overawed by his presence. The private meeting between Obama and Traoré was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 90 minutes. No press availability afterward. No joint statement. Just a brief acknowledgement that the meeting had occurred and discussions had been productive. What actually happened in that meeting became the subject of intense speculation because both sides remained unusually tight-lipped. But eventually, through sources present in the room, the broad outlines emerged. Obama had opened with his characteristic charm and intellectual engagement, praising Traoré's commitment to Burkina Faso's development, acknowledging the legitimate frustrations with historical economic arrangements, expressing understanding of the desire for better terms. Then he'd shifted to concerns about the precedent being set, about the impact on investment climate, about the risk that aggressive contract renegotiation could frighten off capital that Burkina Faso desperately needed. Captain Traoré, I understand the impulse to restructure these mining agreements. The royalty rates were indeed low by international standards. Local processing requirements make sense. But there's a balance to strike. If international investors perceive Burkina Faso as hostile to existing contracts or unpredictable in honoring agreements, capital will flow elsewhere. And Burkina Faso needs that capital for development, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. You risk winning the battle over mining contracts but losing the war for development. It was delivered with Obama's signature thoughtfulness. Not a lecture but a concerned observation from someone who wanted to help Traoré avoid mistakes. Traoré listened respectfully, then responded with equal directness. Mr. President, with respect, the argument you're making, that we must honor unfavorable agreements to maintain investor confidence, is the same argument that's been used to maintain extractive arrangements across Africa for decades. It treats investment capital as more important than fair terms. It suggests that Burkina Faso should accept being underpaid for our resources because demanding fair payment might upset investors. That's not balance. That's subordination with a development framing. Obama tried to reframe. I'm not arguing for subordination. I'm arguing for pragmatism. The global economy operates on certain principles. Countries that work within those principles tend to do better than countries that challenge them. Not because the principles are necessarily just, but because that's how power is currently distributed. You can fight that system, but the cost will be borne by ordinary Burkinabe people who need development now, not after some future restructuring of global economic relations. Mr. President, the cost is already being borne by ordinary Burkinabe people. We've been working within those principles you described for 60 years. We've honored contracts. We've welcomed investment. We've followed IMF guidance. And we remain desperately poor while our gold leaves the country at rates that would make us middle income if we captured even a moderate share of its value. So the pragmatic approach you're describing has a 60-year track record of failure. Trying something different isn't ideological. It's rational. Obama shifted tactics. Let me ask you something. What's your end game here? You renegotiate contracts. Get 15% royalties instead of 10%. Require some local processing. Then what? Do you have the institutional capacity to ensure compliance? The technical expertise to maximize value from local processing? The economic infrastructure to absorb the revenues productively? Because I've seen well-intentioned resource nationalism fail not because the principles were wrong, but because the implementation capacity wasn't there. Those are real challenges. We're building that capacity. It takes time. But here's what I know, we won't build capacity if we're locked into contracts that transfer most value offshore before we can capture it. The only way to develop implementation capacity is to take control of resources and learn by doing. Yes, we'll make mistakes. But they'll be our mistakes, building our capacity, serving our learning curve. Better than perpetual dependency on foreign expertise that has its own interests. The conversation continued for another hour. Obama trying various angles, the importance of rule of law and honoring contracts, the risk of Chinese exploitation filling any vacuum created by Western corporate withdrawal, the personal political risks Traoré faced if economic reforms didn't deliver quick results. Traoré responding to each argument with the same core logic, that Burkina Faso's development required capturing more value from its own resources, that historical arrangements had failed to deliver that, and that changing those arrangements necessarily meant challenging the interests currently benefiting from them. At one point Obama had said something that revealed the real purpose of his visit. Captain Traoré, there are American companies that have operated in Burkina Faso for decades. They've invested billions. They've operated in good faith under the contracts that existed. If those contracts are unilaterally rewritten in ways that make their investments unprofitable, that's not just bad for them. It's bad for U.S.-Burkina Faso relations. It affects how the U.S. government views this relationship and what support we're willing to provide. It was a threat. Politely delivered, but a threat nonetheless. Unilaterally change mining contracts and face consequences in bilateral relations. Traoré's response was immediate. Mr. President, first, these contracts weren't negotiated between equals. They were negotiated when Burkina Faso had no leverage and needed any foreign investment we could get. Renegotiating them now that we have some leverage isn't unilateral breach. It's correcting an imbalanced arrangement. Second, if American companies have operated in good faith, they have nothing to fear. We're not seizing assets. We're not expelling anyone. We're requiring that future operations occur under terms that better serve Burkina Faso. Companies can accept those terms or exit. That's normal market dynamics. Third, if the U.S. government conditions bilateral support on our acceptance of unfavorable mining contracts, that proves my point about subordination. You're saying we must accept being underpaid for our resources or face political consequences. That's economic coercion, not partnership. Obama's characteristic cool had shown signs of frustration. You're being unnecessarily rigid. There's space for compromise that serves both your development needs and reasonable investor expectations. Mr. President, every compromise I've been offered involves Burkina Faso accepting less than we're demanding in exchange for maintaining relationships with partners whose assistance has failed to develop our country for 60 years. That's not compromise. That's pressure to accept subordination. And respectfully, I'm not going to do it. Not for American companies. Not for American government pressure. And not even for you, despite the enormous respect I have for what you represent historically. The meeting had ended shortly after. Cordial but clear. Obama had come to pressure Traoré into moderating his gold sector reforms. Traoré had declined to be pressured. The visit concluded the next day with Obama delivering a speech at the University of Ouagadougou that had been carefully negotiated. It praised African agency and self-determination but also emphasized the importance of stable investment climates and honoring international agreements. It was Obama at his most careful, saying things that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the listener's interests. The speech at the University of Ouagadougou was vintage Obama. Eloquent, carefully balanced, designed to sound supportive while delivering a subtle message that challenged Traoré's approach without directly naming him. Africa's future belongs to Africans. This is not a revolutionary statement. It's a simple truth that should guide how we think about development, governance, and economic policy. But with that agency comes responsibility. Responsibility to make decisions that serve your people's long-term interests, not just short-term political gains. Responsibility to build institutions that outlast individual leaders. And responsibility to engage with the global economy in ways that are pragmatic and sustainable. He continued, I understand the frustration with historical arrangements. With contracts negotiated when African nations had little leverage. With terms that didn't fully reflect the value of African resources. These grievances are legitimate. But the solution isn't to tear up agreements and create uncertainty that frightens away the investment you need. The solution is patient, strategic renegotiation that improves terms while maintaining the relationships that facilitate development. It sounded reasonable. Progressive even. But everyone in the room understood the target. Traoré was in the audience, sitting with university leadership. His expression gave nothing away. After the speech, during the question and answer session, a student asked Obama directly, "Mr. President, Burkina Faso has recently renegotiated mining contracts to increase royalty rates and require local processing. Some say this is economic sovereignty. Others say it's dangerous nationalism. What's your view?" Obama smiled. "I think there's a difference between economic sovereignty and economic nationalism. Sovereignty means making decisions in your country's interest. Nationalism means making decisions based on ideology or political positioning rather than practical outcomes. Burkina Faso has every right to seek better terms. But those terms should be negotiated in ways that maintain investor confidence and build long-term partnerships. If the approach is confrontational rather than collaborative, if it's driven more by anti-Western sentiment than by careful economic analysis, then it risks harming the very people it's meant to help." Another student, clearly sympathetic to Traoré, asked a follow-up, "But Mr. President, these contracts have existed for decades with low royalty rates. Companies have made billions in profits. When should a country say enough is enough and demand fair terms even if companies call it confrontational?" Obama's response was carefully calibrated: fair terms are important. But fairness has to be assessed in context. What might seem unfair in isolation might have been reasonable given the risks companies took, the infrastructure they built, the expertise they provided. Unilaterally rewriting terms after companies have made investments based on agreed contracts, that's not fairness. That's changing the rules after the game has started. And it makes other potential investors think twice about entering the game at all. The audience was divided. Some students nodded in agreement. Others looked frustrated at Obama's defense of corporate interests disguised as pragmatic advice. Traoré had not been scheduled to speak. But when the moderator asked if he wanted to respond to the question, he stood. The room went completely silent. This was the confrontation everyone had wondered about. Obama and Traoré, two black leaders from different generations and contexts, addressing the same question with fundamentally different frameworks. "Mr. President, with great respect, I want to challenge your framing. You said unilaterally rewriting contracts after investments have been made is changing the rules after the game has started. But the rules were rigged from the start. Burkina Faso negotiated those contracts from a position of desperation and dependency. Companies knew they were getting favorable terms. They've made extraordinary profits for decades based on those terms. Now we have some leverage and we're saying the terms need to change. That's not changing the rules. That's refusing to keep playing a rigged game." He continued before Obama could respond. "You distinguished between economic sovereignty and economic nationalism. But who makes that distinction? When Burkina Faso demands 15% royalties, which is still below what many resource-rich nations receive, is that sovereignty or nationalism? When we require that some processing happen locally so Burkinabe workers gain skills and Burkinabe economy captures more value, is that sovereignty or nationalism? It seems that sovereignty is when we make decisions that align with Western corporate interests, and nationalism is when we make decisions that challenge those interests." Obama interjected, smiling but firm, "Captain Traoré, I understand the skepticism about Western intentions. But there's a practical question you haven't answered. What happens when companies decide Burkina Faso's terms make operations unprofitable and they leave? What happens to the workers who lose jobs? The communities that depend on mine operations? The government revenues that disappear? Theory is wonderful. But in practice, people need those jobs and that revenue now. Mr. President, in practice, companies operating in Burkina Faso have been profitable at current royalty rates. Increasing rates to 15% doesn't make operations unprofitable. It makes them less profitable. There's a difference. Companies threatening to leave aren't saying operations would be unprofitable under new terms. They're saying they prefer the old terms where they made more money. That's not economic necessity. That's negotiating leverage. And if some companies leave, others will come. Chinese companies. Turkish companies. Gulf state investors. The idea that only American and European companies can develop African resources is itself a form of neocolonial thinking. The audience stirred. This was more direct than most African leaders ever got with Obama, especially in public. Obama maintained his composure. I'm not suggesting only Western companies can develop African resources. I'm suggesting that alienating existing investors while betting on hypothetical future investors is risky. Chinese companies may accept higher royalties, but they bring their own labor, reducing local employment. They have their own political agendas. You might find yourself trading one form of dependency for another. We might. Which is why we're diversifying partnerships rather than replacing one dominant partner with another. We have some Chinese investment. Some Turkish. Some Russian. Some Gulf state. And yes, still some Western. No single partner can leverage their position into control. That's actual sovereignty, not the sovereignty you described where we're sovereign as long as we make decisions Western partners approve of. Obama tried a different approach. Let me ask you personally, Captain Traoré. You're a military officer. You came to power through unconstitutional means. You're making dramatic economic changes that create uncertainty. How do you ensure this doesn't become another case of a revolutionary leader who starts with good intentions but ends up creating chaos that harms ordinary people? How do you avoid becoming just another strongman who blames external forces for problems of his own making? It was a direct challenge to Traoré's legitimacy. Delivered with Obama's trademark smoothness but pointed nonetheless. Traoré's response was equally direct, Mr. President, you're right that I came to power through unconstitutional means. The constitutional means had produced a government that couldn't deliver security, couldn't negotiate fair economic terms, and was widely seen as serving external interests over national interests. So yes, we changed that government through military action. But we've committed to returning to constitutional governance once security is stabilized and economic reforms are secured. And we're doing exactly what we said we'd do, improving security and restructuring economic relationships. If that makes me a strongman in your assessment, then perhaps the definition of strongman includes anyone who challenges Western economic interests. As for avoiding chaos, let me turn the question around. How do we avoid the chaos of perpetual poverty caused by extractive contracts that transfer wealth out of Africa faster than development can be built? Because that's the chaos we've lived with for 60 years. The chaos you're warning about, that's hypothetical. The chaos of extraction-based poverty, that's real and ongoing. I'm trying to end it. If that creates discomfort for Western partners who benefited from the status quo, that discomfort is not my primary concern. My primary concern is whether ordinary Burkinabe people are better off in 5 years than they are today. The moderator tried to move to another question, but Obama held up his hand. One more thing, Captain. You mentioned that you're diversifying partnerships. But you're also alienating long-standing partners. The United States has provided security assistance, development aid, humanitarian support. When you reject that relationship in favor of partnerships with authoritarian states, you're making a statement about values. About what kind of governance model you're aligning with. That has consequences beyond economics. Traoré smiled slightly. Mr. President, the United States has provided assistance to Burkina Faso for decades. And security has gotten worse. Poverty has persisted. So the assistance, whatever its intentions, hasn't delivered results. You're arguing I should maintain that relationship based on values. But which values? The values of continuing failed strategies because they're delivered by democratic partners? Or the values of trying new strategies that might actually work even if they're supported by less democratic partners? Because if the choice is between democratic values that don't deliver security and authoritarian partnerships that do, I have to prioritize security. My people are dying from insurgent attacks. They're not dying from insufficient democracy in partner countries. And frankly, Mr. President, lecturing me about authoritarian partnerships when the United States has supported countless authoritarian regimes, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, various dictators across Africa and Latin America, when those regimes served American interests. That's not about values. That's about selective application of values when convenient. I'm being honest about my priorities: Burkinabe security and development. I wish American foreign policy was as honest about its priorities instead of cloaking strategic interests in values language. The room was electric. Students were pulling out phones. This exchange would be everywhere within hours. An African military leader directly challenging Barack Obama in public on African soil about American foreign policy contradictions. Obama knew he'd lost control of the event. His visit, meant to subtly pressure Traoré and position Obama as the wise elder statesman, had instead become a platform for Traoré to articulate exactly why he was rejecting Western economic frameworks and American advice. The former president wrapped up quickly after that, thanking the university, praising African youth, making generic statements about partnership and shared futures. But the damage was done. The story wasn't Obama visits Burkina Faso. The story was Obama challenged on mining policy by Traoré, who blocked access and publicly rebutted his arguments. Within 48 hours, the narrative was set. African media celebrated it as a rare example of African leaders standing up to even the most sympathetic Western pressure. Obama's Burkina Faso visit backfires as Traoré refuses to be pressured. Former U.S. President challenged on mining contracts during university speech. Progressive American media was conflicted. Obama was a beloved figure. But his defense of corporate interests and warning against resource nationalism sounded uncomfortably similar to arguments used to maintain exploitative arrangements for decades. Conservative media used it to attack Obama. Even Obama can't control radical African leaders. But that narrative fell flat because Traoré's arguments were substantive, not radical. Mining companies and their advocates were frustrated. They'd hoped Obama's visit would moderate Traoré's position. Instead, it had given Traoré a platform to explain his position to a global audience with Obama as the foil. 2 weeks after the visit, a journalist asked Obama about it during an unrelated event. "Mr. President, your Burkina Faso visit seems to have backfired. Captain Traoré used it to reinforce his position rather than moderate it. Do you regret going?" Obama was measured. "I don't regret engaging. Engagement is always better than isolation." Did I change Captain Traoré's mind? No. But I made clear what the risks of his approach are. What he does with that information is up to him. I hope for the sake of the Burkinabe people that he's right and I'm wrong. But history suggests that confrontational resource nationalism doesn't end well. I was trying to help him avoid mistakes others have made. But privately, according to sources close to Obama, he was frustrated. The visit had been a miscalculation. He'd thought his personal prestige and careful arguments would influence Traoré. Instead, Traoré had used the visit to demonstrate that he couldn't be influenced even by the most respected black political figure in modern history. 6 months after Obama's visit, Burkina Faso had successfully renegotiated contracts with most major mining companies. Those unwilling to accept new terms had been replaced by other investors, primarily Chinese and Turkish companies willing to pay higher royalties and invest in local processing. Government revenues from gold had increased by approximately 40% despite some production decreases. Most importantly, Traoré had demonstrated that an African leader could say no to pressure from even the most sympathetic and prestigious Western figures and survive. Years later, when asked about blocking Obama's access to mining sites and publicly challenging him, Traoré said, "President Obama is a historic figure. First Black American president. Someone I greatly respect for what he achieved. But that respect doesn't mean accepting his advice when his advice serves American corporate interests more than Burkinabe development. He came to pressure me into moderating our mining reforms. I blocked access to mining sites because I wouldn't let him use his visit to pressure companies or workers into resisting reforms. I challenged him publicly because his arguments needed to be challenged. He framed resource nationalism as risky and confrontational. I framed it as necessary correction of rigged arrangements. He warned about frightening investors. I explained that investors were still profitable, just less so. He suggested I was being ideological. I demonstrated I was being practical based on 60 years of evidence that his preferred approach doesn't work. Did it damage our relationship? Probably. But the relationship was never as important as the principle. If accepting Obama's advice meant accepting continued exploitation of Burkinabe resources, then his friendship isn't worth having. He represents an era of African leaders being grateful for Western attention and deferential to Western advice. I represent an era of African leaders making decisions based on African interests and defending those decisions even against the most prestigious critics. That's the transition that needed to happen. And it happened in that university exchange.